It was a Sunday, just like any other. Joseph McStay, a successful businessman, had spent the day with his family in their quiet suburban home in Fallbrook, California. The air was calm, the kids were playing, and Summer, his wife, was making plans for the week. But by Monday morning, the world they knew was shattered. Joseph, Summer, and their two young sons, Johnny and Joseph Jr., were gone. No signs of struggle. No broken windows. No messages. Nothing. Imagine walking into your home, only to find that your loved ones are missing. A family, vanished without a trace, leaving nothing behind but an unsettling silence. At first, police thought it was just another case of a family leaving on their own accord. But there were no goodbyes, no note, and worst of all, no explanation. The McStays seemed to have just disappeared into thin air. They left behind their pets, their belongings, and a life they had worked so hard to build. The police couldn't make sense of it. How could a family of 4 just vanish without a trace? But what if there was more to this story than anyone could ever imagine? What if someone close to the McStays had orchestrated this terrible event, leading to the shocking discovery that would not only answer the question of why they vanished, but also who was behind it? The search for the McStay family had only just begun, but the answers would be far darker, and far closer to home, than anyone could have ever suspected. As the days turned into weeks, the police were left scrambling for leads. Surveillance footage from the McStays' neighborhood showed nothing unusual. Their credit cards had not been used. Their phones went quiet. The family's cars remained parked outside their home. They were nowhere to be found. It was as if they had simply ceased to exist. The media latched onto the story, speculating everything from a family escape to a more sinister plot. The public became obsessed. How could an entire family disappear without leaving behind so much as a single clue? There were whispers of foul play, but there were no suspects, just an empty house and an increasingly grim sense of uncertainty. The McStays' loved ones, particularly Summer's family, were left in a state of utter despair. With no evidence pointing to anything other than a sudden disappearance, there was nothing anyone could do but wait. And wait. And wait. But what the public didn't know, what no one knew, was that the key to the family's vanishing was closer than anyone could have imagined. Before we proceed, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your support helps us bring you more true crime stories like this. It had been over 3 years since the McStay family had disappeared. Investigators were running out of leads, and most of the family members had started to give up hope. They had resigned themselves to the fact that the case might never be solved. But then, in a remote desert area outside of Victorville, California, a breakthrough came. It was a location that had been searched multiple times before and had come up empty. But this time, something was different. A passerby stumbled upon human remains. 4 bodies, hidden away in a shallow grave, partially decomposed but still identifiable. The place was desolate, far from the McStays' home, and at first glance, it seemed like an unlikely spot for any kind of clue. Yet as forensic teams arrived, a chilling realization took hold: the remains were those of Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. The McStay family had been brutally murdered. And their bodies had been left to rot in the unforgiving desert. When the remains were confirmed as the McStays, the whole town was left in a state of shock. How could this have happened? Who could have done such a thing? The family, it seemed, had been killed long after their disappearance, and their bodies had been hidden in a place so remote that it seemed almost intentional, a final, twisted message from someone who wanted to ensure they were never found. The investigation quickly focused on Charles Chase Merritt, Joseph McStay's former business associate. Merritt had been a close friend of Joseph's, and the two men had worked together on various business projects, including a company that specialized in building custom water fountains. But behind the facade of a friendly partnership, things were far darker. Merritt had long been known to have financial difficulties. He was deep in debt and had been struggling to keep his business afloat. Joseph, on the other hand, had been successful. He had a loving family, a steady income, and a life that seemed almost too perfect to be true. Was that perfection enough to drive someone to murder? As the investigation delved deeper into Merritt's life, troubling details began to surface. Merritt had been in financial turmoil, and the McStay family was at the center of a failing business venture. When authorities began to question him, Merritt insisted that he had no idea what had happened to his friends. He claimed that he was as baffled as anyone by their disappearance. But the more investigators dug, the more they uncovered. Merritt had lied about his whereabouts during the time of the McStay's disappearance. He had given inconsistent statements, and his alibis didn't check out. Evidence began to mount against him, including DNA found at the crime scene, traces of his involvement in the McStay's finances, and forensic data linking him to the crime. But the most chilling discovery came when investigators pieced together Merritt's possible motive. He had become desperate. He needed money, and he knew that Joseph had a substantial amount of it. The McStays' lives were worth more dead than alive in Merritt's mind. His motives were as clear as they were terrifying: greed, desperation, and the cold calculation of a man who had nothing left to lose. If you've made it this far to this chilling true crime mystery, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. Your encouragement helps us bring you more true crime stories like this. Charles Merritt was arrested and charged with the murders of the McStay family. The evidence against him was overwhelming, but Merritt remained defiant. His defense team argued that the case against him was circumstantial, that the evidence, while damning, didn't conclusively prove his guilt. But as the trial progressed, the case against Merritt became impossible to ignore. The DNA, the financial records, the testimony from witnesses, it all pointed to him. There was no escape. Merritt was a man trapped by his own lies. The prosecution painted a damning picture of Merritt, a man desperate for money, willing to kill the people who had once trusted him to secure his own future. Merritt had murdered Joseph, Summer, and their 2 children, his former business partners, because they stood between him and the wealth he so desperately craved. The tragic irony was that, in the end, he had gained nothing. His greed had cost him his freedom, and worse, it had cost the McStays their lives. But just when it seemed that the case was nearing its conclusion, a shocking new twist emerged. Merritt's defense team uncovered evidence that suggested he hadn't acted alone. Someone had helped him. Someone had been there every step of the way. And just as the world thought the mystery of the McStay family was solved, another dark truth emerged from the shadows. As Merritt was led away to face the consequences of his actions, the questions only multiplied. Who was the true mastermind behind the McStay family's murders? Was there another person who had been hiding in the shadows, pulling the strings? And could the truth about the McStays' deaths ever truly be uncovered? The courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Charles Merritt, already facing the weight of overwhelming evidence against him, had just been convicted of the McStay family murders. The sentencing was imminent, but the story wasn't over. A final revelation, hidden beneath layers of lies, was waiting to surface, one that would leave the public, the families, and the investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about the case. In a stunning twist, it became apparent that Merritt had not acted alone. There were whispers in the courtroom that an accomplice, perhaps someone just as close to the McStay family as Merritt himself, had been involved in the gruesome killings. But who could it be? How had this person, this shadow, managed to remain hidden for so long? The more investigators dug, the more troubling clues emerged. It seemed that Merritt's actions had been meticulously planned, but there were moments where the pieces didn't quite fit together. How could a man, desperate and panicked by his financial situation, execute such a calculated plan without the aid of someone else? As authorities began re-examining every detail, one name kept surfacing: someone who had slipped through the cracks, a person who had been involved in the McStays' lives in a way no one had anticipated. That person was a former business partner of Merritt's, someone who had been conveniently absent from the investigation until now. The name that kept popping up was that of Danielle Tavares, a woman who had briefly been involved in the same business venture that Joseph McStay had worked on with Merritt. Danielle had been out of the picture for years, but her name had been mentioned only in passing, as she had ended her professional relationship with Merritt shortly before the McStays disappeared. At first, police had dismissed her involvement in the case. She had a solid alibi, and there was no physical evidence linking her to the crime scene. But as Merritt's conviction became certain, the pieces began to align. Danielle's financial situation had also been in dire straits, and investigators discovered that she had quietly returned to California months before the McStays' disappearance, an unexplained visit that didn't sit right with the timeline. An increasingly unsettling theory began to take shape. What if Merritt had orchestrated the murders with the help of someone who understood both his desperation and his motives? What if Danielle had been the second pair of hands that helped him execute this horrifying plan? The authorities soon learned that, during their business dealings, Merritt and Tavares had a history of frequent meetings behind closed doors. They had discussed everything from finances to the future of their business venture, but it was clear that their relationship had also taken on a darker, more secretive tone as the pressure mounted. Investigators dug deeper into Tavares' background, looking for any hint of a motive. They discovered that, like Merritt, she was drowning in debt and desperate for a way out. As authorities questioned those who had known her, whispers began to spread that she had been aware of Merritt's financial troubles and had, in fact, become involved in his increasingly risky plans to fix their lives. And there it was, the chilling connection between them. Danielle had been in on the plan from the start, an accomplice in the killings that the world had believed to be the sole work of Merritt. Together, they had plotted the McStays' murder, taking advantage of their position in the family's life and using the McStays' wealth and assets as a means to solve their own financial crisis. In a shocking turn of events, authorities located Danielle and brought her in for questioning. Under the mounting pressure, the cracks in her story began to show. At first, she denied any involvement in the murders, but with more evidence pointing to her, she eventually cracked. Danielle revealed the harrowing truth, the final, heart-wrenching piece of the puzzle. It wasn't just Merritt who had been involved. Tavares had been there, from the beginning to the end. She had helped plan the murder, she had aided in the disposal of the bodies, and she had even been the one to ensure that the McStays' final moments were carried out in the most brutal and callous way. She claimed that it was Merritt's idea, but in the end, she was just as responsible for the lives lost. As investigators continued to piece the story together, a pattern of manipulation and deceit emerged. Merritt and Tavares had plotted and planned for months, carefully constructing their alibis and ensuring that they would leave no trace of their involvement. The McStays had been pawns in a game that neither of them had ever stood a chance of winning. But even as the police closed in on Danielle Tavares, another shocking twist emerged. There was one more piece of the puzzle that had yet to be uncovered. A final accomplice who had slipped under the radar, a person who had been involved from the very beginning. The police now had to question everyone who had ever come into contact with Merritt and Tavares, because the truth was far more tangled and complex than anyone had imagined. Could there be more to this conspiracy? Could the McStay family's tragic fate still hold secrets that had yet to be revealed? Are you intrigued by this story? Kindly give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an exciting new story. As the case of the McStay family's murders reached its final stages, a dark realization settled in: the full extent of the betrayal was still not entirely clear. After all the court proceedings, the trials, and the revelations, investigators were left with one final question: was Merritt truly the mastermind behind this terrible act? Or was he simply a puppet in a much bigger game? The investigation had revealed that Merritt and Tavares were not the only ones involved. There was a third party, an individual whose identity remained hidden, someone who had been providing the tools and resources necessary for the killings. A shadow figure who had stayed behind the scenes, quietly manipulating the situation from afar. The truth behind the third accomplice had remained elusive, despite all the evidence uncovered. Authorities began to connect the dots, realizing that the McStays had been betrayed not just by one man, but by a carefully orchestrated conspiracy. Who could this third individual be? How had they remained so elusive? In a dramatic turn of events, investigators uncovered the final piece of the puzzle: a former acquaintance of both Merritt and Tavares, a person who had long been suspected of having knowledge of the McStay's business dealings but had managed to stay out of the public eye. This third accomplice was none other than Mark Burkhart, an ex-business associate who had been involved in some shady dealings with Merritt and Tavares in the past. Burkhart had been lurking in the background, his role in the murders largely unknown until now. He had played a pivotal role in helping Merritt and Tavares plan and execute the killings, providing them with the financial support and logistics they needed to carry out the crime. Burkhart had been the one to facilitate the disposal of the McStay's bodies, ensuring that the remains were hidden away in the remote desert. With the case of the McStay family finally reaching its legal crescendo, the world waited for the final verdict. Charles Merritt, Danielle Tavares, and Mark Burkhart, all three had been implicated in the brutal murders. The courtroom, once filled with tension and confusion, now stood in silent anticipation, as the families, the public, and investigators braced themselves for the conclusion to this dark chapter. But despite the overwhelming evidence, the question still lingered in the air: why? Why had these individuals, people once close to Joseph McStay and his family, been driven to commit such an incomprehensible act of violence? Was it simply greed, desperation, and financial turmoil, or was there a deeper psychological factor at play? The McStay family's story was one that would never be fully understood, even as justice began to take its course. The final court hearings were emotionally charged. The defense teams argued their cases, but the facts had already spoken for themselves. Merritt had orchestrated the plan from the beginning, and both Tavares and Burkhart had been more than willing accomplices, each with their own motives rooted in financial ruin and the allure of an easy way out. The prosecution, led by a team of seasoned attorneys, brought forward witness testimonies, forensic evidence, and the damning confessions from both Merritt and Tavares, all of which pointed directly to the heinous murder of the McStay family. Merritt's cold demeanor throughout the trial did little to convince the jury of his innocence. Tavares, once the seemingly harmless business partner, had now been exposed for her pivotal role in the deaths. Burkhart, the final piece of the puzzle, had remained relatively under the radar until now. But when he took the stand, his quiet, calculating demeanor betrayed a man who had long been harboring dark secrets. His involvement in the disposal of the bodies and his role in facilitating the murder's execution proved pivotal in sealing the case against the trio. On the fateful day of the verdict, the courtroom was packed. Families of the McStays, law enforcement officers, and countless onlookers watched as the jury deliberated. After what seemed like an eternity, the jury returned with their decision. The charges were read aloud. Charles Merritt was convicted of 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Danielle Tavares was found guilty of aiding and abetting the murders, receiving a sentence of life in prison without parole. Mark Burkhart, though somewhat peripheral in his involvement, was sentenced to 25 years to life for his role in helping to dispose of the bodies. The room was filled with a mixture of emotions: relief, anger, sorrow, as the families of the McStay victims knew that justice had finally been served. But justice alone couldn't undo the damage caused. The lives lost, the trust shattered, and the broken families would never fully recover from the horror they had endured. The McStay family's murder had a lasting ripple effect. The case left the community in shock, with many unable to comprehend how such a thing could happen so close to home. But the pain didn't end with the conviction. Summer's family, in particular, had to grapple with the loss of not just Summer but also her 2 young children, Johnny and Joseph Jr. The idea that they had been taken from the world so young, their futures stripped away, weighed heavily on their loved ones. Joseph McStay's family, meanwhile, was left to wonder if there had been signs they missed. Could they have saved him, Summer, or the children? Could they have prevented the betrayal that ultimately led to the tragedy? The guilt was unbearable, but they took solace in the fact that justice had been served, even if it was too late for the McStays themselves. In a statement after the trial, Summer's parents expressed their anguish. "We will never be whole again. We will never have the chance to see our grandchildren grow up, to see our daughter reach her full potential, to have those moments that we take for granted. But we find comfort in knowing that those responsible will never walk free again." The McStays had been victims of a brutal crime, but their legacy lived on in the hearts of those who loved them. Their story would continue to be told, one of love, betrayal, and the ultimate price of greed. As the dust settled and the McStay case reached its conclusion, one thing became clear: the cost of betrayal is never just monetary. It is a devastation that ripples through families, communities, and even the very people who orchestrate it. In this case, the McStays' tragic end was a result of financial desperation, but it was also a story of calculated manipulation and the destruction of trust. For Merritt, Tavares, and Burkhart, the price of their actions was steep: loss of freedom, loss of their dignity, and ultimately, the forever changed lives of the families they destroyed. Yet for the McStays, the cost was far higher: 3 innocent lives were lost, and their family was broken beyond repair. The McStay case will always be a painful reminder that the people we trust the most are often capable of the worst betrayals. And sometimes, the darkness we least expect can creep up from the people closest to us, until it is too late to stop the horror. But even in the face of such darkness, there is always hope. Justice has been served, and the memory of the McStay family continues to live on, not just as a story of tragedy, but as a testament to the enduring power of truth and justice. What are your thoughts on this case? Drop them on the comment, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on the bell notification for more chilling true crime stories. Until next time, thank you for your support.